But we are going to make a start now. So welcome everyone that's here, but a special welcome to Graeme Maxton, who, through our really good fortune, has come to speak to us today. This is a man who's got something to say. He has been speaking and writing for some time, but I think you'll agree with me, by the end of this, he really has got something to say, partly because he has been speaking to people and world leaders, industry leaders, etc. He has spoken to quite a lot of people, met with them, heard them. And that really gives him something to talk about. And I hope you'll hear something of that. His life so far has been full of this sort of activity. Climate change has been fairly close to the center of it. And we'll hear something maybe later on about that. He's, as I say, he's met some, he opens his book, his most recent book, A Chicken Can't Lay a Duck Egg. He opens this book with a description of meeting the Pope, and that is quite something. His style, he's got a website, he's got a Wikipedia entry, and he's got his own website. And the style you'll see on his website is really pleasing, light and incisive. A couple of articles he's written recently, one of them attracted the attention: Natural Capital and How I Tried to Monetize My Kisses. It's quite short, but you can get the sense of how incisive he is in terms of getting to the heart of the matter. And we may hear a bit about this, how the free market addled your brain and why it can't fix the climate change. He's done a lot of things, but just a few bits taken off his website as to what he is doing, apart from about to speak to us. He is an advisory board member of the United Nations Pathways Project. He's a member of the editorial advisory board of Population Matters. And he's a research affiliate of the somewhat ancient university, the Ludwig Maximilian University in Germany. So he's not only done things, he is engaged with things. And I'm going to hand you over to this man, if I could find him on the screen. Yes, there somewhere.
He's right at the bottom in the middle.
Right at the bottom in the middle.
Well, not quite at the bottom, just in the middle.
I've got you. Okay, I had to find you because I'm going to bring you out for everyone to see. And thank you very much, Graeme. Over to you.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I'd also like to thank Graham Blackburn in Edinburgh who made this possible. And thank you all for giving up some of your Saturday morning to come along and listen to me. I know some of you are joining from Asia and Australia, so thank you for giving up your Saturday evening. All of us have a worldview. We all have a picture of the world inside our heads. We're not born with this worldview. It evolves as we grow. Our picture of the world changes as we go to school, as we have experiences, as we make friends, as we work from colleagues, and as we travel. And we build this picture of the world inside our heads about the way the world works. And we have our opinions and our values, and a lot of our behavior is determined by this worldview. This worldview becomes relatively sticky as we get older. There's also a collective worldview. The people that live in Scotland have a view of the world which is different from the worldview of those who live in Germany, Australia, or Japan. And there's also, I argue, a worldview that belongs to the rich world, that the billion richest people in the world, the people that live within the neoliberal economic system, have a view of the world which is slightly different from other views of the world. And I'm going to argue that it's this worldview, it's this mindset that is restricting positive change from a planetary point of view for humanity. I'm going to talk about climate change as an example of this sticky thinking, an example of how this mindset blocks change. But I could equally well have talked about inequality or global poverty, because they're also being blocked by this worldview that's held in the rich world. At the core of this worldview lies the economic system. The economic system, I'm going to argue, is not a science, it's a belief system, which is a bit like a religion. It's a set of ideas which people believe because they're viewed as rational, and so they're believed to be real. As I'll explain a little bit later on, I see this as a kind of a brainwashing, that we've adopted this worldview, we've adopted this economic system inside our heads, but it's not actually a good reflection of reality. I'm going to argue that this system cannot be reformed, cannot be improved, and all those ideas about downsizing or changing it or improving it are not going to work. But what we need to do is build a completely different system. And so the task that lies ahead of us is identifying the seeds of that other system and then building a better system to make the current one obsolete. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change, just to give you a bit of a background about what's happening with the climate. As I say, I could talk about inequality, I could talk about poverty, because it's the same mindset that's blocking change there. Let me see if I can share my screen for a second. Okay, can you see that? Can everybody see that? Yes, okay. So this is a picture of the temperature, of the average temperature on planet Earth for the last 12,000 years. On the far left-hand side, you can see that arrow pointing down, and that goes down to the end of the last ice age, about 11,500 years ago. And you can see that over the following 2,000 years or so, the temperature gradually rose until it reached something like the average we have had for the last 10,000 years. And it's fluctuated around that level for about 10,000 years. On the right-hand side of the chart, you can see a small blip upwards, and it says medieval warming period. And this is the time where the temperature on Earth got slightly warmer, and it was possible to grow grapes in Scandinavia. And this is often used by people who deny that climate change is a problem, because they say that temperature is always fluctuating. But actually, you can see that the increase during the medieval warming period was comparatively small. It was a fraction of a degree centigrade. And we know that it also only affected the northern hemisphere. It didn't affect the whole planet. And then below that, you can see another little blip downwards, which is known as the Little Ice Age, where rivers in Europe began to freeze over. And that lasted for more than 100 years. You can see that it took several hundred years before the Little Ice Age kicked in, and several hundred years before it stopped being a problem. And most of that was because of volcanic activity. And then you can see on the far right, the black line shoots up. And that's the last 200 years of the temperature on planet Earth. Now, because it's been such a big change, and because it's happened so quickly, this cannot be down to anything else than human activity. It has to be because of something humanity is doing. And of course, we know what that is because of burning fossil energy, that we're releasing all of that coal, oil, and gas, and these fossil fuels that have been trapped below the surface of the Earth for millions of years. All the gases are being released in a very short period of time, and that's polluting the atmosphere and creating a warming of the planet. You can see in September 2023, which was a blip, it's an exceptional month so far, where the average temperature was 1.8 degrees above the long-term average. But we're shifting into territory which is comparatively unknown, certainly for the last 12,000 years. And actually, we're moving into territory which hasn't been seen for more than 100,000 years. Now, what's particularly interesting about this when it comes to the mindset is that we haven't done anything to fix this problem. We've known about this problem for more than 50 years, and humanity has done effectively nothing to change it. The situation is worse than ever, and the heating is accelerating. At the IPCC meeting in Paris in 2015, the IPCC said that we should avoid a temperature increase of more than 1.5 degrees. Now, in the whole of 2023, we actually reached that level. And the concentration of gases in the atmosphere to make that a permanent change to the atmosphere actually took place in 2019. We won't see a regular, an annual increase of more than 1.5 degrees for perhaps another decade, but we've now passed the atmospheric concentration that makes that inevitable. I'll just stop sharing my screen for now, if I can do that. Right. At the rate we're currently releasing these gases, we will pass through the level which makes a 2-degree increase in average temperatures inevitable within about 10 years, probably about 7 or 8 years. And the danger with passing through 2 degrees is that it'll kick off a chain reaction. The glaciers will melt more quickly, the polar ice caps will melt more quickly, the forests will begin to die off, and all of this will lead to a chain reaction which will accelerate the warming process. The planet will become less reflective, the trees burning will release more gases into the atmosphere, and we'll kick off a chain reaction which will last for centuries. So technically, there's still time to act. Technically, we have another 7 or 8 years that we could do something to avoid this crisis. But the steps required are now too large and too difficult. If we wanted to slow the pace of climate change today, we'd effectively have to stop burning fossil energy tomorrow. We'd have to cut our use of fossil energy almost to zero within a decade if we wanted to try and avoid a catastrophe. And of course, because fossil energy burning, because the energy that's produced is the fuel that drives our economic system, if we did that, then our economic system would grind to a halt. And so, I argue, nothing will happen. And an existential crisis that we could have avoided is now going to hit us, and there's nothing much we can do about it, and it will last for many decades, in fact, many generations to come. I think it's understandable why societies don't act now. The steps required are simply too large and too complicated and too difficult for people to get their heads around. But the focus of my research for the last couple of years has been, why have people not acted before? We have, as a species, an inclination to want to try and survive. We have a survival instinct, and yet here we're doing something which is going to kill a lot of people. It questions our future. And so why have we not acted before? And I think there are 4 reasons, which I'll talk about. And then I think there's this mindset problem. There's this philosophy issue. There's a philosophical reason why we've not acted. Of the other reasons, the 4 other reasons, I think one of the reasons that we haven't responded is a lack of understanding. Although the scientists have understood what's happened to the climate, the politicians haven't. They haven't understood the scale or the urgency of the problem. And that's certainly not been helped by people like the fossil fuel industry publishing articles which throw doubts about the science, and so have made people question whether or not this is a real phenomenon. A second reason is that humanity, people have a natural short-termism. We tend to think about problems that are local, and we think about the short-term issues, and this is a long-term global problem, which is not an area that many people feel very comfortable in thinking about. There's also a lack of apparent urgency, certainly within the rich world, that over the last 30, 40 years, the number of events, climate change events has been increasing and is accelerating. Wildfires, floods, droughts, they've all been causing more problems, but the number of casualties, the number of deaths in the rich world has been comparatively small so far. And so it's seen to be a problem for future generations. It's not thought to be a problem for the existing political group to fix. They see it as something which can be fixed in the future, and that's a grave mistake, unfortunately. And then finally, this political expediency, that politicians understand correctly that if they did what's necessary to slow the pace of climate change, it would be politically very unpopular, and so they don't do what's required. But I think the biggest reason that we haven't changed and we haven't taken the steps that are necessary here is because we've got this fixed mindset. We've got this sticky worldview in the rich world which blocks change. Just see if I can share my screen again here. How's that? This is a chart from the United Nations. It's the Human Development Index. And it shows from 1990 to 2015 that according to the UN's measures of progress, this is the way we think about progress, and I've highlighted the word think because it is a perspective on progress. It is not necessarily definitive. But the way we think about progress suggests that everything is moving in a good direction. Every part of the world over these years has been improving. Now, the way the UN defines human progress is through longevity, longer lives. People live longer lives, they have more years of education, and they have higher average incomes. And so, according to those measures, humanity is progressing. Now, it's a philosophical discussion as to whether or not that is actually a good measure of progress, but it is the way the UN does it, and it's the way that most people view progress. And because of this, we're seeing a rising population. The population in the world has increased from 3 billion people in 1960 to more than 8 billion people today. And so again, we see this as a sign of progress in humanity. Now, we think that this is because of economic growth. We think that economic growth is the fuel that is leading to this trend of upward human development. And we think also that this trend is forecast to continue. This is a chart from Goldman Sachs last year, and you can see its forecast for GDP in various parts of the world through to 2070. And you can see that they think the trend is going to continue accelerating. Another study by PwC, also in 2023, shows much the same. And they think that by 2050, the world's GDP will have doubled. The United Nations has predicted that by 2050, the global population will have risen to nearly 10 billion people. So we'll have another 2 billion people in the world. And interestingly, the forecast from the fossil fuel industry, this is a forecast from BP, that even in 2040, 75% of all the energy we use will come from burning coal, oil, and gas. And so there's an expectation in the rich world, because these are rich world models, that what's been happening over the last 70 years, this trend of human development, will continue into the future. It will continue for at least another 30, 40 years. So business as usual, in other words. There's also a very strong belief that these two trends are linked, that human development, that human progress, that the improvement in life expectancies and in education is because of economic growth, that economic growth is the fuel that brings higher living standards. Now, I want to emphasize that we think that's the case. I'll come back to that issue in a second. The point I want to make first, though, is that these future expectations by Goldman, by PwC, and others by the UN are in stark contrast to those of climate scientists. That according to Jürgen Randers, who has a model, he's a climate scientist who has a model which looks at all sorts of aspects of the impact of climate, the world population will peak just after 2030 at just over 8 billion people. So the global population will not increase much more from where it is today, because the death rate will accelerate because of the impact of climate change. There are other forecasts that show that by 2050, there will be no more fish in the sea. That by 2050, more than 4 billion people, so half the global population today, will be living under water stress, that they will have a shortage of access to water. The climate scientists also say that by 2040, most of the Arctic ice will have gone in the summer. And the United Nations says that the planet will become partially uninhabitable, that parts of the world will not be habitable by 2050. And we'll see increasing storms, increasing floods, rising sea levels. By 2050, 800 million people, 1 in 10 people, will be impacted by rising sea levels and have to relocate. And all of these weather events will bring rising food supply concerns, water supply concerns, more wildfires, and because of all of that, rising migration. Hundreds of millions of people are going to have to leave places where they're unable to live any longer because of rising temperatures or water shortages or crop failures. And they're going to have to go to places where they're not welcome. So how to explain this disconnect? On one side, we've got the business community, the political community, the United Nations, all saying that the business is going to continue as usual. And you've got the scientists and the climate scientists saying that's not the way things are going to happen at all. And so far, the predictions of the climate scientists have been mostly correct. If anything, the pace of change is faster than they anticipated. So why does nobody listen to them? And I argue that it's because of this mindset. It's because of this sticky thinking. After decades of following this long trend, the politicians are simply unable to consider any other alternative. There's a common sense belief that economic growth brings higher living standards and longer life expectancies, that it improves inequality, that it creates jobs, that it encourages investment and creates this upward spiral of human development. And they think that only growth does this, that only economic growth creates this upward spiral. They don't think, for example, about reducing inequality through redistribution, about giving money from the rich to the poor. They don't think about that as a solution to inequality. They think that economic growth is the only way that we can reduce inequality. They don't think about regulating food production so that it improves life expectancies. They don't think about stopping people eating food which is shortening their lives. They think growth is going to improve life expectancy. And they don't think about creating jobs like Roosevelt did in the 1930s with his New Deal, where you create jobs, the state creates jobs without any economic growth at all. They think about the only way to create jobs is through economic growth. Now, this is a big problem because growth is the cause of climate change. Climate change requires us, sorry, let me explain that slightly differently. Economic growth is increase in output. It's a boost, it's an increase in output. Now, to increase output requires more energy. And because we use more energy, we use more fossil fuels, and that creates more emissions. And that creates climate change. So the drive for economic growth is the drive for climate change. The assumptions behind this growth focus are also increasingly questionable. The system doesn't do what people think it does any longer. Economic growth doesn't always create work. It doesn't always create jobs. In fact, economic growth comes from rising productivity. It comes from doing more with less, or using fewer inputs or using the same inputs to create more output. And so economic growth often comes from mechanizing. It comes from replacing people with machines. So it actually comes, in many cases, from reducing the number of people that are working. It doesn't always come from new investments and the creation of jobs. It comes often from reducing the number of people who work. Economic growth also doesn't reduce inequality. Inequality has been rising in much of the world. And inequality today in many parts of the world is as high as it was in 1820. The gap between the rich world and the poor world is as big today as it was more than 200 years ago. So inequality has been rising despite all this economic growth. Economic growth also has not been reducing poverty. Although the oft-quoted statistic from economists that says we've lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty between 1990 and 2015, actually this is a misleading way of looking at it. Yes, it's actually true that 1 billion people have been lifted out of living on $1.25 a day, but they live on $1.40 or $1.60 a day instead. They're still extremely poor. And yet they've been taken out of this category of being poor and put into a different category. And so this myth has been spread that economic growth reduces poverty. More than half the world's population still lives on a very low level of income despite decades of economic growth. There's also the idea that free trade raises all the boats together, that everybody benefits from free trade. But actually, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's the rich world and the multinationals that gain the most from this process. It's also no longer true that life expectancies are rising as they used to be. That this link between growth and life expectancies has been broken in many countries. In much of the rich world, in Japan, in Germany, in the US, and the UK, life expectancies have been declining. Now, partly that's because of an aging population, but it's also because of falling healthcare standards and poorer diets and often more medical problems. But this link between life expectancies and economic growth is not nearly as clear as it used to be. There's also the link between living standards and economic growth has been broken, that in much of the rich world, living standards have stagnated. Average incomes in the US are barely higher than they were in the late 1970s in real terms for most of the middle classes. So a lot of the claims that are made about what economic growth achieves are no longer true, and it's creating this enormous environmental problem. There's also a sense that a lot of this push for economic growth has a kind of empire building mentality from a geopolitical perspective. That there's the rich world has been pushing this economic system onto the rest of the world, and that has created international division. There's a sense that you're either with us or you're against us. You're either going to adopt this free market neoliberal system or you're not. And if you're not, then you're going to be, to some extent, demonized. It's a sort of cultural racism. It's still a colonial mentality that the West is trying to push a system of economic development on the rest of the world. And if they don't like it, then they tend to be pushed aside. Recently, this is also creating a very interesting development, that there's the beginnings of a new non-aligned movement coming together of countries that don't want to follow this neoliberal economic system, that want to have a different way of thinking about progress. So you've seen the BRICS countries expanding to rival the G7, and you've seen the Shanghai Cooperation Organization also expanding recently, with other countries joining, forming a counterbalance to the G7, the main global powers. And these two blocks also have an interesting perspective that they see the decline of the West coming and the failure of this economic system. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, there really has only been one political choice: neoliberalism. There's been this free market system, this Leviathan, which has taken over. And this is part of this mindset. We believe those who benefit from the system when they say that the system improves well-being, even though it doesn't. So we're believing something which is actually not true. And this is part of this mindset I was talking about at the beginning. We believe that the system is good for us, but it's actually killing us. And it's a form of power. That there's a political leadership where the worldview of the rich and the corporates is being supported by the majority of people in the rich world, even though it's not in their best interests. There's no need for the rich or the corporates to coerce us or use force, because we accept this system as true, even though it's not. It's a form of voluntary brainwashing, I'm arguing. What are the pillars of this system? Let me just define what this system is that's got inside our heads. And as I said at the beginning, it's a belief system. It's a belief system as much as a religion. We believe that economic growth is essential. We believe that regulation should be minimized. We believe that the market will determine the best outcome for society. We think that competition is better than cooperation. We think that trade should be free. We think that destruction is creative. We think that science and technology are evidence of human progress, even where the impact is negative. We think that freedom is the ability to act without any restraint, regardless of the social consequences. Now, the School of Philosophy understands that freedom has a completely different historical background in European and Greek philosophy. It's about what's inside your head, not what you do. We believe that nature should be given a monetary value. We believe that being rich is better than being poor. We believe that the present is better than the past, and that progress is unidirectional. We believe that governance should be democratic, although in much of the rich world that's become nominal in practice. And it's used to undermine developing countries. The US military handbooks talk about using democracy as a way of creating chaos in the poor world so that it's easier for the rich world to control them. But the notion that democracy is the least bad form of governance is an idea which is spread around and which we're expected to accept. And if any questioning of democracy or any suggestion of any other form of governance is regarded as taboo. These ideas form the central narrative that supports the interests of the rich and corporates. They're accepted by the majority as a sort of common sense and truth, even though they're just beliefs, and they're not in the long-term interests of the majority. It's been argued by Alexander Dugin, who's a philosopher in Russia, that there is actually no active political system in the West any longer, because there is just this one philosophy. That power resides in the hands of the rich and the corporates, and that consumerism and individualism are the natural order for the rest of us. There's no need to offer voters any choice because the Western economic system is the rich world's historically determined destiny. Those who live in the rich world are encouraged to see it as the destiny of humankind. I'm going to argue that this is in some ways similar to the thinking that took place in Germany in the 1930s and in Austria in the 1930s. The Nazi mindset that people believed there was a view of the world which was fundamentally wrong, and that it's similar to also the view that was adopted in China in the 1960s in the Maoist times, that everybody adopted a worldview which was fundamentally detached from reality. And that this is what we're doing in the rich world today. We have this worldview which is fundamentally detached from reality, and it is creating all sorts of problems for humanity. It's creating these economic problems, it's creating inequality, it's creating poverty, or it's stopping us solving those problems, and it's creating climate change. It's a mindset that controls our views, our values, and our actions. Much of this mindset is not true, or it's certainly very questionable. But we accept it as reality because we're not thinking, because we've got this stickiness inside our minds. We don't know that this is happening. We think that this is still true. And so we've been brainwashed, but we still think that we're thinking rationally. And that is what makes any effective response to climate change impossible. And that's what makes it impossible for us to deal with poverty and inequality too. Where do we move from here? I think defining where we are is relatively simple, and I hope I've helped do some of that this morning. Defining the problem is relatively simple. Where do you want to go? Now, I'm going to argue that that's actually relatively simple too, and the School of Philosophy and Economics has done a lot of the work, as have a lot of other people already. Let me just give a little sort of snapshot of where that is. Sorry, I've gone a little bit too far there. I'll change to a different screen here. Sorry. Sorry, I'll do that without showing you a chart in that. How do we define a better economic system? As I said, I think that's relatively simple to do, and a lot of people have given thought to that already. A better system, we have to respect nature. We have to live in balance and in harmony with nature. We have to have a duty of care for existing and future generations to look after nature and make sure that generations that come after us are not disadvantaged. We have to meet everyone's needs fairly. We have to ensure that there are equal rights for future generations and other species. Where we are able to make productivity gains, we have to offset that with increased leisure time, not with increased output. There has to be some sort of level of inequality, I would argue, because we're not all the same, and those who take responsibility for society have to see some sort of reward, but we have to maintain inequality within very strict boundaries. The system has to have a goal of improving human well-being and eradicating injustice. The population has to be controlled in some way. We can live with 8 billion people on Earth, but the average living standard for everybody will be very low, or we can live with 1 billion people on Earth with the average living standard being very high. This is a very controversial issue and very difficult to discuss, but it's an issue which has to be discussed if we're to live in harmony with nature. And we have to live with some sort of common good responsibility. We have to protect the land and use it in moderation. So the framework for a sustainable system, a sustainable model for human progress is not terribly difficult to imagine. What form of governance should that take? I think that's something that we need to put some more research into. It may be democratic, but perhaps if it is democratic, it has to be much more along the lines as democracy was originally conceived in Athens. And perhaps it needs to be in small cells, a bit like a beehive, rather than one great monolith, which is national or international. But that's perhaps an area for further research. Perhaps we need some sort of technocratic form of governance, as was tried in Austria a few years ago, where you have defined experts looking after protecting nature and protecting human interests. I don't know, but this seems to me an area where there's work to be done. I think another area where we need to give more thought is how we make this transition to a better system as the impact of climate change grows. So let me just finish off then with, if I can go back to sharing my screen again here, with a quote from Buckminster Fuller. If you can, oh, this one here. I can, going back with this. This is a quote from Buckminster Fuller, and I think it's exactly the way we see the world. I see the world today. We can't change the existing system. The existing system is blocking us from making the changes that are necessary. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And to me, that's the way we have to think ahead. We need to start building a better system, which is in better balance with nature, and only then can we solve some of the big problems that face humanity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Graeme. That was magnificent. You really did have something to say.